There is one sentence, spoken off the cuff on a random Thursday night into a phone camera propped up on a table, that has detonated more family group chats in 72 hours than any celebrity headline of the entire year, and by the time I finish walking you through it, you are going to understand why half the internet is calling it the smartest parenting rule ever said out loud and the other half is calling it the cruelest thing a mother could ever promise her own child. Because here is what actually happened, and I need you to sit with the timeline of it, because the timeline is the part everybody skipped. Late Thursday night, July 23rd, Cardi B came home from dinner with friends, opened up Instagram Live, and started talking. No press junket. No publicist crouched off camera holding cue cards. No brand deal to protect, no album cycle to promote, no interviewer steering her toward a safe answer. Just a woman who had been out for a few hours with people she trusts, still in that loose, unguarded, post-dinner headspace where the filter comes down and people say the thing they actually think instead of the thing that tests well. And somewhere in that stream, the conversation drifted to a subject most parents will do absolutely anything to avoid answering in public. Sons. Dating. And what happens in the house when a rule gets broken in the single worst way it can possibly be broken. Cardi said the dinner table had landed on that exact question. What do you do if your son brings a girl home and things go further than they were supposed to go? She did not stall. She did not do the thing famous people do where they give you 4 minutes of language and 0 position. She answered it in about 9 seconds, and those 9 seconds are now the most argued about parenting statement of the year. Her first answer was actually the reasonable one, which is why almost nobody clipped it. Cardi said she is not the kind of mother who bans girls from the house. Her sons are allowed to have company. Girls can come over. That is not the fight she is picking. But there is one condition attached to it and the condition is non-negotiable. The doors stay open. Not cracked. Not almost. Open. And then Cardi B said something that a whole lot of parents privately agree with and almost never admit into a microphone. She said boys, in her experience, are harder to control than girls. They are going to do what they have already decided to do, and a mother standing in a doorway issuing instructions is not going to override that. So she does not waste her energy trying to control the outcome. She controls the opportunity instead. That is the entire logic of the open door. It is not a ban. It is a limit. She is not trying to stop biology. She is trying to remove privacy from it. That alone would have made a decent clip. That is not what went viral. What went viral is the sentence she said next, and I want to give it to you plainly, without decoration, because the decoration is what has people arguing past each other online. If one of her sons ever comes to her and tells her he got a girl pregnant, that is the day he moves out of her house. Not eventually. Not after a family sit-down where everybody processes their feelings and maps out a plan over the next few months. That day. And the reasoning she attached to it is the part that separates this from every other viral tough love soundbite you have heard, because she did not frame it as punishment. She framed it as a transfer of category. In her words, getting a girl pregnant is the decision that ends boyhood on contact. The second it happens, you are not a boy in your mother's house anymore. You are a man. And in her house, being a man means the financial support stops immediately. No mother's money. No father's money. And no mother's roof either. Cardi repeated that last part almost like she was reciting something she had already settled in her own head long before that live ever started. Which, as you will see in a minute, she almost certainly had. Now here is where most of the internet stopped listening, and here is exactly why the reaction went as sideways as it did. Because if all you saw was a 9-second clip of a rich woman saying she would put her teenage son out on the street, then of course you clipped it, of course you were disgusted, of course you fired off a comment. But she did not leave it there. She kept talking. And what she said after that turned a viral soundbite into something a lot more structured, a lot more deliberate, and honestly a lot harder to dismiss. Because Cardi B did not deliver a vague threat with nothing underneath it. She laid out an entire financial architecture for her children. The kind of thing most parents describe in fuzzy generalities during a serious conversation and almost never spell out with actual conditions attached, and almost never on camera where the whole world can hold them to it. Here is the deal Cardi B described, and pay attention to the conditions, because the conditions are the whole story. Once her kids hit their teenage years, they get an allowance. Structured money, from her, as a baseline. Then at 18, if they want to move out of the house, she will help cover their rent. She is not throwing them into the deep end with nothing. She will pay. But there is one gate they have to walk through to unlock that support, and the gate has exactly 2 doors. They have to either be in school, finished with school, or actively building a business. That is it. That is the entire arrangement as Cardi laid it out. Ambition gets funded. Effort gets funded. Direction gets funded. And a pregnancy that lands before either of those milestones is met cancels the whole thing, instantly, with no exceptions and no cooling off period where everybody negotiates a softer version of the rule. And when Cardi explained why the cutoff is that hard, she did not hide behind sentiment. She said if she let a son stay comfortable after making that decision, he would make it again. And again. Because there would be no real cost attached to it. Comfort, in her framing, is what deletes consequence. Take the comfort away, and suddenly a decision that used to be weightless has weight. That is not an emotional argument. Strip the celebrity off it and that is a behavioral one. It is the oldest incentive argument there is. Remove the safety net, and the behavior that quietly depends on that safety net existing becomes a lot less attractive to gamble on. Which brings us to the internet, and I need to tell you up front that this one did not split the way these usually split. Normally you get 80% piling on one side and a lonely 20% in the replies getting flamed. This one split almost dead down the middle, and the middle ground practically does not exist. There is no lukewarm take on this. Everybody has a position and everybody is certain. The first camp lined up behind Cardi B completely, and the phrase you could not escape in the comment sections and the reaction videos was tough love. Their argument, laid out cleanly, goes like this. Cardi is not punishing her sons for dating. She is not punishing them for having girls over. She is not punishing them for having a relationship, or a girlfriend, or a normal adolescence. Cardi drew exactly one line, and that line sits around one specific thing. Unprotected sex that results in a pregnancy nobody planned for. And their follow-up point is the one that actually landed hardest. A teenage boy who knows in advance, in explicit terms, exactly what that outcome costs him might genuinely stop and think before he gets there. More than one comment reframed her rule from punishment into deterrent, and that reframe is doing a lot of work, because a punishment arrives after the damage and a deterrent arrives before it. If the floor disappears the instant the mistake happens, the mistake stops being a risk you can shrug at. Then somebody in that camp raised a point I did not see coming, and it is the point I keep thinking about. What about the girl? Because there is a second person standing inside that hypothetical, and she has not been part of the conversation at all. The argument goes that a young man raised knowing the full financial and domestic cost of careless sex is more likely to use protection, more likely to have an honest conversation with a partner before anything happens instead of a panicked one after, and more likely to treat the whole situation as something with actual stakes attached to it. In that reading, the rule is not only about her son. It quietly protects somebody's daughter too. And I am going to be honest with you, that is a stronger argument than the clip's critics wanted to deal with. But now let me give you the other side, because the other side is not stupid, is not lazy, and did not just skim the headline. Their pushback is genuinely hard to answer. Their position is this. A scared teenager who has just found out he is about to be a father needs support on that specific day more than any other day of his entire life. And pulling the floor out from under him at the exact moment the ground is already collapsing does not manufacture a man. It produces a kid with nowhere to sleep at the worst possible moment he has ever lived through. One comment summed the whole counterargument up in a single line. Actions have consequences, sure, but kicking him out immediately could push him further into trouble instead of teaching him anything real about responsibility. And there is a follow-up to that objection that I think is the single sharpest thing anybody said about this story on either side. If you strip a young father of his stability at the precise moment he is trying to process the biggest decision of his life, you may not be creating a more responsible man. You may be creating a man with every incentive in the world to disappear. Because if facing it costs him his home, his money, and his family's support, and vanishing costs him nothing he has left, then the math starts pointing the wrong direction. In that reading, the rule that was designed to force accountability could accidentally manufacture the exact absent father it was built to prevent. So which one is it? Deterrent or detonation? Because it genuinely cannot be both, and nobody arguing about it online can prove their side, and I will show you exactly why in a minute. Here is what I need you to notice first, though, because this is the part that reframes the entire fight. Neither camp is arguing from nowhere. Neither one is obviously, embarrassingly wrong. One side is arguing that consequences shape behavior and that removing comfort accelerates maturity. The other side is arguing that removing comfort at the moment of maximum vulnerability does not build maturity at all, it deletes the support system maturity normally requires in order to grow in the first place. And here is the uncomfortable truth underneath all of it. That argument is not new. It is not hers. It did not start on Instagram Live. Parents have been having that exact fight inside kitchens and living rooms and church parking lots for decades, long before anybody had a phone to broadcast it from. Consequences versus support. Discipline versus safety. Hard line versus soft landing. What the Cardi B clip did was hand a decades-old argument a face. A famous face. A specific, recognizable, quotable face, with an actual number attached to it and an actual deadline and an actual condition. And that is a huge part of why it moved as fast as it did. People were not reacting to a celebrity opinion. They were reacting to a version of a fight they have already had in their own family, sometimes about themselves. Some of the loudest comments under this Cardi B story were not really about Cardi at all. They were people telling on their own childhoods. People saying this is exactly what happened to me at 17. People saying my mother said the same thing and she meant it. People saying my mother said the same thing and she did not mean it, and that is why I never took her seriously again. That is why the numbers on this clip look the way they do. It did not go viral because it was shocking. It went viral because it was familiar. Now, there is a timing detail sitting on top of this story that changes how the whole statement reads, and almost nobody covering it bothered to place it in the frame. So let me put it there. Cardi B is pregnant right now. Fourth child. Her first with her boyfriend, NFL player Stefon Diggs. And she is already raising 3 children from her previous relationship with Offset. So this rule is not coming from someone theorizing about hypothetical teenagers from a comfortable distance with no skin in the game. It is coming from somebody actively running a large, blended, still expanding family in real time, in public, under a level of scrutiny that almost no other parent on earth has to perform under while making the exact same decisions the rest of us get to make privately in a kitchen at midnight with nobody filming. That context does something to the clip. Because a childless commentator saying this would be theory. A parent of 1 saying this would be posturing. A pregnant mother of 3, about to be 4, saying it out loud while the whole internet watches is something else entirely. She is going to have to live inside this rule. Publicly. For the next 15 years. And everybody now has the receipt. But there is a second detail, and this is the one that cracked the story open for me, because it takes the rule out of the category of viral outburst entirely and moves it into something that looks a lot more like a philosophy she has been building for a while. In a separate recent podcast appearance, Cardi B talked about what she actually wants for her kids. And her answer was not what you would expect from the woman in that clip. She said she wants her children to end up as a better version of herself. More disciplined than she was. More capable than she is. Able to do things she says she cannot do herself. And Cardi was careful about it. She specifically clarified that she does not want them to be perfect. She is not chasing perfect children. She just wants them better than she was. Then Cardi said the part that reframes the pregnancy rule completely. She said whatever she instills in them now, including the parts they are going to resent while it is happening, is something she expects them to understand and appreciate later in life. Even if there are tears involved. Even if there is frustration. Even if they hate her for it in the moment. Now put those two moments side by side. The podcast and the live. Watch what happens. Because suddenly the rule is not anger. It is not a mother lashing out at a mistake her toddler has not made yet. It reads like a direct application of the exact philosophy she described out loud in a completely different room on a completely different day. Discipline enforced now, while it is unpopular and uncomfortable and makes her look like the villain, in exchange for a stronger person later. Every part of that sentence is in the podcast. Every part of it is in the live. Same argument. Different setting. That is not a viral moment. That is a consistent position. And whether it works is genuinely unknowable, which is the frustrating part nobody on either side of this wants to admit. Whether removing a teenage son's housing on the same day he becomes a father actually produces the disciplined, capable, better-than-me adult she is describing, or whether it backfires into precisely the instability the second camp is warning about, is not something either side can prove in advance. Not with data. Not with anecdotes. Not with a comment section. It is a bet. That is all it is. It is a bet Cardi B is making, built out of her own history of getting shoved into adult responsibility fast and early, and the internet is split roughly 50-50 on whether it is a smart bet or a reckless one, and neither half gets to collect on it for about 15 years. But now I have to tell you the detail that flips this entire story upside down, and I want you to be sitting down for it, because when I found this I had to stop and read it twice. Because everybody has spent 72 hours arguing about this rule as though it is about to be enforced. As though there is a teenage boy in that house right now, sweating, doing the math on his housing situation. As though this was a mother reacting to something that had already happened under her roof. None of that is true. Let me lay out the actual family, precisely, because the Cardi B household is bigger and more complicated than one soundbite ever captures. She is currently a mother of 3. Her daughter Culture. Her son Wave. And her daughter Blossom, all from her relationship with Offset before the couple's public split. The 4th child, the one she is carrying with Stefon Diggs right now, has not been born yet. So when the Cardi B rule went viral, when the entire internet went to war over it, when both camps dug in and started arguing about a young father being put out on the street on the worst day of his life, do you understand who this rule technically applies to at this exact moment? One son. Wave. Who is a toddler. A toddler. Years away from any of this being a live issue in his own life. Years away from a girlfriend. Years away from an allowance. Years away from an 18th birthday, a rent conversation, a business plan, or a school enrollment form. There is no crisis in that house. There is no teenage boy waiting on a verdict. There was no incident. Nothing happened. Which means this was never a reaction. It was a preemptive stance, laid out years in advance, on camera, apparently because she wanted the expectation on the record long before it could ever possibly become relevant. And that single fact reframes everything you have read about this story so far. Because a mother who says this after something goes wrong is angry. A mother who says this before anything has gone wrong is planning. Those are not the same thing, and the entire internet spent 3 days arguing about the first version while the second version was sitting right there in the transcript. Once that detail started circulating, watch what happened to the reaction, because it mutated. A whole portion of the response stopped being about whether the rule was fair at all. It became about the fact that she was thinking this far ahead in the first place. Comment after comment picked up on the same observation. Most parents do not sit down and pre-build a consequence structure for a toddler's hypothetical teenage decisions. Most parents do not have a policy. Most parents improvise, badly, in the middle of a crisis, at 11 at night, while emotional, and then spend a decade defending whatever came out of their mouth. Almost every one of these conversations in real life is reactive. Something goes wrong, then the rules get invented on the spot to match the damage. Cardi B did the opposite. She wrote the policy before the incident. And a chunk of commenters, including a surprising number who said outright that they disagree with the content of the rule, said that the level of intentional forward planning stood out to them regardless. You can think the rule is too harsh and still notice that almost nobody plans parenting this way. And then there is the financial structure, which developed its own completely separate thread of commentary somewhat detached from the pregnancy clause, and this is the part one think will actually outlive the viral moment. Because when people stopped reacting to the shock line and started reading the whole arrangement, a different picture emerged. An allowance in the teenage years. Conditional rent support after 18, tied specifically to school enrollment or building a business. That is not a rule about sex. That is a philosophy about what earns continued support and what does not. A large chunk of commentators read it as exactly that, and once you read it that way, the pregnancy clause stops being a standalone rule at all. It is not primarily about contraception. It is one specific trigger inside a much larger system she has built around adulthood. The system says forward motion gets funded. School gets funded. A business gets funded. Effort gets funded. And anything that stops the forward motion before either milestone is reached ends the funding. Getting a girl pregnant before hitting one of those two markers is not the crime in that framework. It is the trigger. It is the thing that proves, in her logic, that the forward motion stopped. And once you see it as a system instead of a soundbite, the argument changes shape again. Because now the question is not is it cruel to put a young father out. The question is whether tying support to productivity is a legitimate way to raise a child, or whether it turns a parent's love into a performance review with a rent check attached. That is a much harder question. And notice that neither camp online was actually arguing about that one. They were arguing about the shock line, because the shock line is easier. And that gap, between the question people were fighting about and the question actually sitting on the table, is the whole reason this story has been so exhausting to watch. Because every serious objection to what Cardi B described lives in that second question, and almost nobody raised it. Nobody asked whether a child should have to earn a roof. Nobody asked what happens to the kid who is not academic, not entrepreneurial, and just genuinely lost at 18, which describes an enormous number of 18-year-olds. Nobody asked whether tying rent money to productivity teaches responsibility or quietly teaches a child that his mother's support comes with a performance clause attached to it. Those are the questions that would actually pressure test this system, and they got buried under 3 days of people screaming about a toddler's hypothetical girlfriend. Let me go back to something Cardi said in that live, because there is a phrase in there that I do not think got nearly enough attention, and it is the phrase that explains her entire model. She said the doors cannot be closed. Sit with how small that rule is. It is not a lecture. It is not a purity speech. It is not a threat. It is a piece of household architecture. She is not attempting to legislate what a teenage boy wants, because she has already conceded, out loud, that she cannot. She said boys are harder to control and they are going to do what they want to do regardless of what their mother tells them. That is a mother admitting the limits of her own authority, which is a genuinely unusual thing for anybody to admit on camera. So instead of pretending she has control she does not have, she removes the conditions that the behavior requires. No privacy, no closed door, no opportunity. It is the least preachy version of this rule that exists. There is no morality in it at all. It is logistics. And that is the same brain that wrote the financial plan. Notice the pattern. She does not moralize. She engineers. She does not say do not do this because it is wrong. She says here is what this costs, here is when the money stops, here is what unlocks it again. Every single rule she described is a mechanism, not a sermon. Even the pregnancy rule, which sounds like the most emotional thing she said, is structured as a pure cause and effect statement. This happens, then that happens. Whether you love this woman or you cannot stand her, that is a coherent operating system. It is internally consistent from the open door all the way to the rent money. And coherence is not something you usually find in a viral parenting clip. Now, the part everybody wants me to address, and I am not going to dodge it. Is it fair? Here is my honest read, and you are absolutely free to come for me in the comments, because I know a lot of you are going to disagree with me on this one. The rule as it was actually stated is more defensible than the clip made it look, and less defensible than her supporters are pretending. Both things are true simultaneously. It is more defensible because of the advance notice. This is the piece the outrage crowd keeps skipping. Every child in that house is going to grow up knowing this rule word for word. There is no ambush. There is no surprise. Nobody gets to be blindsided at 17 by a policy invented in the heat of the moment. That advance clarity genuinely does change the moral weight of it, because the person who violates a rule they have known since childhood is in a completely different position from a kid getting sentenced under a law written 5 minutes ago specifically for him. That distinction matters in every system humans have ever built. But it is less defensible than her supporters want, and here is why. Because a rule announced when a child is a toddler has to survive contact with a real human being 15 years later. And on that actual day, it will not be a policy anymore. It will be her son. Standing in front of her. Terrified. 19 years old, or 17, or 22, with news he cannot take back and nowhere to put it. And the question that day is not whether the rule was fair when she announced it. The question is whether she executes it. Because a rule she does not enforce is worse than no rule at all, since she has now taught her children that her hardest line is negotiable if they cry hard enough. And a rule she does enforce means she is choosing consistency over her own child on the single worst night of his life. That is the trap. That is the actual thing. And I do not think either camp online has fully reckoned with it, because both of them are arguing about a hypothetical teenager instead of about the mother who has to look him in the face. So here is a question I want you to actually answer in the comments, and I want you to be honest instead of performing. If it were your son standing in front of you, with the rule already stated, already known, already agreed to, and he tells you tonight, do you enforce it? Or do you fold? Because I think a lot of people cheering right now would fold. And I think a lot of people calling her heartless right now know deep down they would enforce something. And there is one more layer to this that I have not seen a single person online bring up, so let me be the one to say it. Cardi B is not talking about strangers. She is talking about her own kids, but she is also, unavoidably, talking about herself. Because who exactly do you think this rule was written by? A woman who has spoken repeatedly, publicly, for years, about being pushed into adult responsibility young. A woman who built her entire life out of a position with no safety net, no cushion, no fallback, no one covering the rent while she figured it out. A woman who said out loud on a podcast that she wants her children to be more capable than she is and more disciplined than she was. Read the pregnancy rule again in that light and it stops sounding like a punishment aimed at her son. It starts sounding like a woman trying to reproduce the one condition she believes made her, while sparing her kids the parts of it that nearly broke her. That is why the plan has an allowance in it. That is why there is rent money attached at 18. That is why school counts and a business counts. She is not trying to recreate hardship. She is trying to isolate the one ingredient in her own story she thinks was load-bearing, which is the absence of a soft landing, and hand her children everything else. Whether that is wisdom or whether that is a woman generalizing from a sample size of one is exactly the argument the internet is having, and it is a real argument, and I am not going to pretend it has a clean answer. Because here is the counter that keeps nagging at me, and I want to give it its full weight instead of a token mention. What made Cardi B did not make everyone. That is the thing about survival stories. You only ever hear them from the people who survived. There is no viral clip from the version of that story where the safety net came away and the person did not rise to the occasion. Those people do not get a microphone. Which means the whole philosophy is built on a sample that has already been filtered. That is not a small objection. That is the strongest objection in this entire debate, and it did not come from the loudest comments. It came from the quiet ones. And I want to point out something about how this story traveled, because the way it spread tells you as much as the content did. Clips were everywhere inside a day. Entertainment pages, reaction channels, every platform. And the thing that carried it was not the financial plan, even though the financial plan is by far the most substantive thing Cardi B said. It was not the open door rule, even though that is the most practical thing she said. It was not the podcast philosophy that explains where all of it comes from. It was 9 seconds. The eviction line. Isolated, stripped of the plan that surrounds it, stripped of the fact that it applies to a toddler, stripped of the allowance and the rent support and the school condition and the business condition and every piece of context that makes it comprehensible. That is not an accident, and it is not unique to her. That is the machine working exactly the way the machine works. The most extractable 9 seconds wins, and the 2 paragraphs that explain the 9 seconds die in the archive. Cardi B laid out a whole structured system, and the internet kept 1 sentence, threw away the blueprint, and then spent 3 days fighting over the sentence. And this is where I have to say the thing that is going to annoy some of you. The people angriest about this clip are, in large part, angry at a version of the statement she did not make. They are angry at a mother throwing a scared kid into the street with nothing. What she described was a mother who pays an allowance through the teenage years, helps with rent at 18, funds school, funds a business, and has exactly one condition that voids it. You can still hate that condition. Plenty of thoughtful people do, for reasons I laid out earlier and I think are strong. But hate the actual condition, not the invented one. Because the invented one is the reason this conversation has been so useless for 3 straight days. So let me pull all of it together, because when you put every piece of this on the table at once, the shape of it is clearer than any single clip suggested. What actually exists here is one Instagram Live, filmed on an ordinary Thursday night after dinner with friends, with no strategy and no publicist and no plan to make news, that turned into one of the most heavily debated parenting statements of the year. It was built entirely around a rule an enormous number of parents privately think through at some point and almost never say out loud, with this much specific, financial, no exceptions detail attached to it. And what is certain, no matter which camp turns out to be right 15 years from now, is that the Cardi B household now runs on a written rule, and her sons will grow up knowing in explicit, itemized terms exactly what is expected of them and exactly what happens the moment that line gets crossed. There is no ambiguity left in it. There is no room for anybody to claim later that the boundary was unclear or that nobody warned them or that the rule appeared out of thin air on the worst night of their life. Whether that level of clarity produces the accountable, capable young men Cardi says she is aiming for, or whether it simply strips away support at the exact moment a young person needs it most, is not a question anybody gets to answer this year. Or next year. It may not be fully answerable ever, because there is no control group. There is no second version of Wave raised under gentler rules to compare him to. There is one kid, one household, one set of rules, and one outcome, and by the time we know, nobody will be able to prove which variable did it. That is the part that makes this argument unwinnable, and that is exactly why it will not die. But before I let you go, I want to leave you with the detail I cannot get out of my head, because it is the one that will still matter long after this news cycle burns out. Cardi B has now put this rule on the permanent record. It is on video. It is clipped, reposted, archived, screenshotted, transcribed, and quoted in 100,000 comment sections. Cardi cannot walk it back quietly. She cannot pretend she never said it. Her children will be able to watch it whenever they want, at any age, for the rest of their lives. Which means somewhere around 15 years from now, there is going to be a teenager in that house who has seen this clip. Who knows the exact wording? Who knows his mother said it before he was old enough to understand what a rule even was? And he is going to grow up carrying the knowledge that the policy governing the most consequential decision of his young adult life was written when he was a toddler, publicly, by a mother who wanted zero ambiguity about where the floor was. Is that the greatest gift a parent can give a child, total clarity about consequences, no surprises, no moving line? Or is it the heaviest thing you can hand a kid, a public promise of abandonment attached to a mistake he has not made yet? I genuinely do not know. And I do not think anybody arguing about it online knows either, no matter how loud they are being. But I do know this much. Cardi B answered a question most parents spend their entire lives avoiding, on camera, with numbers attached, with no publicist, on a random Thursday night after dinner, and she did it about a child who is still learning to talk. Most parents will never do that. Most parents will improvise the answer at midnight in a hallway with their voice shaking, 15 years too late. So you tell me which one is worse. Now I want to hear from you, and I mean this specifically, not generally. First question. Do you side with the tough love camp, that a boy who knows the cost in advance thinks twice, or do you side with the second camp, that pulling support on the worst day of a kid's life creates an absent father instead of a responsible one? Pick one. Do not sit in the middle on me. Second question, and this is the one I actually want answered. Were you raised under a rule like this? Did somebody in your family tell you exactly what would happen if you crossed a specific line, and did they mean it, and did it work? Because I have a feeling the comments on this one are going to be more valuable than anything either side of this argument has said publicly all week. And third, for anybody who has already made up their mind. If it were your son, tonight, standing in front of you with that news, would you actually enforce it? Be honest. Nobody in the comments knows your real name. Let me know what you think below, because this one is genuinely split and I want to see where you all land. And if you want the full context, go listen to the entire live yourself instead of the 9-second version, because the 9-second version is why half the internet is arguing about a statement nobody actually made. That is all I have for you on this one, and I will talk to you later.